Hey there, Mike Kalinowski with the Infor OS product management team, and we're going to take a look at how to replicate flat files from a file server using Infor ION suite of technology connectors and move that data up and into the Infor Data Lake so that we can do some big data processing and query and analysis on the data that we've actually stored in our big data platform. Before we get started, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to get updates whenever we upload new content, especially around the Infor Data Fabric, as well as other content and features that you'll find across the Infor OS technology platform. Before we get in, it helps to kind of set the context here and understand what components within the Infor OS ensemble we're going to be leveraging here and how they all work together. And so using technology like Infor ION, we're able to connect applications with one another, whether that be through business object documents or other file exchange, or use the technology connectors to ingest and acquire data from other systems, such as file connectors, APIs, databases, and so on, and move that up into a big data platform so that we have the capability to use technologies like Burst for analytics, Coleman AI for machine learning capabilities, as well as leveraging a lot of the functionality within the Compass suite of SQL tools to connect outside applications and RESTful services to our data lake and be able to analyze and process data loads out of the system as well. Now, with Infor ION, it comes packaged with a suite of technology connectors that allow you to connect to things like network shares, file servers, SFTP servers, even Samba file systems as well, and begin to schedule the retrieval of files or documents that might be stored on those file systems, and then either map that to something like a business object document if you are looking to solve for application integration scenarios, or even move that data as is into a big data platform so that you can then use our query and interrogation technologies to analyze that data. But before we actually get the data into Infor OS and the Infor Data Lake, we need to understand what that data looks like. And so with the Infor Data Catalog, we're able to define and register metadata representations of the information that's actually traversing the ecosystem. And so using step-based wizards, we can very easily help Infor OS very quickly understand new types of content that it's not yet seen before, and then start to use technology like Infor ION to start moving that data from point A to point B. And once we actually move that data up and into the Infor Data Lake, we're able to use RESTful APIs, database drivers, and even an in-browser query editor to start exploring and prototyping our queries and better understand what do we have inside of our data lake, how do we want to blend and join that data together, and then how do we actually connect other applications to be able to leverage these big data insights once we've actually stored the content into the Infor Data Lake. So before we jump into the software, let's take a look at some of the files that we'll actually be uploading into the big data platform. And so we have an example here from a fictional third-party vendor where they've been accumulating data about logins and other information about employees in the network and in the domain. And so we have information like employee ID number, first and last name, email address, IP addresses that were used, and so on. And we want to be able to move this from a file server where this is currently stored and into the data lake so that we can actually start to query this. Now, to get started, we're going to jump into Infor OS and navigate over to the ION Desk application. And within the data catalog, we can very quickly walk through a step-based registration wizard and then upload a sample of our file that we actually want to help data catalog understand. Now, we can increase the richness of the inferences made by uploading multiple files here, but I'm pretty happy to do so with one file. Now, as we step through the wizard, we can provide some additional information like what is the name of our object. In this case, we'll call this employee assets. We can also confirm and make changes to any of the inferences in the data processing or file processing component of this wizard step here as well. So if we had additional column header lines, we can certainly change or define that and tailor that to our particular file that we're actually going to be moving over here. Now, we also see that we are registering this as a CSV file, and that's what we're working with and uploading into the data lake. Now, as we click next, we can see that we've inferred the actual columns within that CSV file. And so we see our employee ID, our username, and so on. Now, we can make changes here, and we can also tailor these definitions to better represent what is the data to our organization. And in this case, our EIN is our employee ID number. And we can provide titles and more verbose descriptions to help us better understand the data that we're actually working with. Now, I can also make changes to some of these pieces of information or properties by selecting something like the employee ID and changing the data type. Now, I know the employee ID is not an integer, but rather a string, given that it has dashes. And the IP address for version 4 here uses dots in the values as well. So we want to change that from a number to a string so we don't have any issues with querying that data later on down the road. Now, I'm pretty happy with our inference over here, and we can further configure and tailor additional metadata characteristics if they exist. So for example, we can define an identifier path, or otherwise known as a primary key, for our data set. So I'll select our employee ID number, and we can also define variation paths and other metadata characteristics to better help the data lake deduplicate the data if information exists to be able to accomplish that. We'll settle down with what we've defined here and move on to ingesting this data into the data lake once we've actually registered and finished our modeling steps within the data catalog here. And once we've finished, we see that we now have a representation of what employee assets looks like based on the file that we actually uploaded and sampled through that wizarding step. Now that we've actually told Infor OS what this employee assets file looks like, we can actually navigate over to ION Desk and help define the connection point configuration to actually pick up a file from a file server and then map that to our new employee assets object name. So I'm going to go ahead and define our employee assets. And we'll select that from our data catalog. And I've already pre-filled in a lot of the configuration of our file name patterns and the directories that we're going to be pulling from. So in this case, I'm perfectly happy with the way that we've configured our file connection point. We'll go ahead and hit save, and then we can navigate over to our data lake flows, where we can then update or add a new data lake flow to describe the movement of information from one file system or an application over to the data lake. Now, we've already started pre-configuring our data lake flow here. All I need to do is just drag and drop our file activity from the toolbox, select our connection point that we want to connect to, and move this data, in this case SG1, and then what information is being exchanged between these two activities here. In this case, that's going to be our employee assets. Now, it's as easy as that, just saving the model and turning on our flow, and then we can begin uploading some content over to our file server here. So let's go ahead and select several thousand rows of data spread across multiple files here, and we'll start that upload. And as this gets uploaded, we'll see that because our data lake flow is currently active, that ION is starting to pick up and process these files over time. And so we'll start to see that these are marked as in process, and that ION is actually moving this from the file server and then actually ingesting it over into the data lake. And if we give this another refresh, we'll see that ION is continuing to process this information. Now, what are we able to do next? Well, if we come back over to Infor OS, we can double check in ION OneView to see all the objects that are flowing through the enterprise service bus. Now in this case, we're just going to do a quick search for the last hour's worth of activity within the system, and we can see that ION's already picked up 3, most likely another 4 or 5 employee asset files from our file server. And we can actually dive into our timeline of events to see what's actually taken place within the system. So we have a timeline that tells us the connection point that we actually ingested data from. We can see that we've captured data over to the data lake. We can actually even peek into the file as well to get a preview of the contents that were exchanged between these two activities here. Now that's great, but we're only storing the data inside of the data lake now. We want to be able to use SQL to interrogate and ask questions of that information and perhaps contextualize it with other data sets that are already inside of the data lake. Now that we've stored this data inside of the data lake and we have confirmation through ION OneView that we've actually moved these files over, we can navigate over to the data lake compass editor and begin querying and exploring that data. And so we can do a quick filter for our employee assets table. In this case, we have our employee assets right here, and we can very quickly generate our SQL select statement and give that a quick format before we run this. And what we'll see is that the data lake is now able to start retrieving information in a relational interface and consumable format that you can start to interrogate and filter on or join these tables to other contents within the data lake, be it CSV files, JSON files, or what have you. So, for example, we could certainly start filtering for additional information about employee ID number 1, and use the Compass SQL toolset to be able to develop arbitrarily complex queries, and then start exploring more information about this data set. Now, This is very useful for being able to prototype our queries, but what we may want to do here is grab this information and then plug that into something like our JDBC driver with Compass, and then connect outside applications or ETL tools to be able to grab the same information and then drive their business process or data-driven use case. And that's all it takes to actually ingest data from a file server and then move that information up into the data lake. Now, for more information, be sure to join our community forums at community.infor.com, as well as subscribing to our Infor OS YouTube channel, where you can learn more about the Infor Data Fabric, as well as other components and features of the Infor OS technology platform.